Hi, it's Mark, back with another Lightroom and Photoshop tutorial, and today we're going to be looking at colour grading largely in Lightroom, specifically focusing on the newish tools that Adobe have added for adjusting the hue, saturation and luminance individually from shadows, midtones and highlights and blending them between that. By and large, colour grading should be subtle. And unless you're actually trying to fix something in a photograph, unless you're trying to get rid of some artifacts, unless you're trying to possibly stamp a particular theme or look that you tend to use repeatedly across your photos, or copy the colours and saturations and such from a particular picture you like into yours, it will and should always remain subtle. To that end, you can get away with doing most everything you need to do in Lightroom. However, it does have its limitations, and we will be exploring some of those and some of the reasons why you still might want to pop over into Photoshop. But let's start in Lightroom. I've got a series of pictures to actually work through. We look at some of the alternates to the panel you can see there on the right hand side. Is it the right hand side when you're looking at it? The panel you can see over there. We'll look at some of the alternatives which already exist in Lightroom, that have existed since time immemorial, and we'll also be looking at how on our adjustment brushes and such you can now actually have range masks in. So let me just drop one in here. So there. We don't know what happened there. Let me drop one in here. Down here you've got range masks which can now adjust for colour and luminance. So that is another way of controlling some of the colour work that you want to do without necessarily jumping over Photoshop. Anyway, that looks awful. I'm going to clean that up. I'll put the pictures we're going to use in a link down below so you can go and get them while the credits are playing, and I'll join you on the other side and let's colour grade some pictures. Okay, so here we are. Here's the colour grading tool. Let's do some basics first. This panel has all three together. I don't particularly like using this panel because it's very difficult with such small squares to actually get an accurate colour. You're relying on possibly looking at some of these values, and subtle changes. A very small movement here can make an appreciable difference if you're colour grading something as subtle as say a skin tone. So I prefer to use the individual highlights, shadows and mid-ranges. And on each of those I also recommend having this value brought down for exactly the same reason. Here we can actually move around the wheel to affect the colours, but we can also just observe the wheel and actually slide the hue, saturation and luminance. So very quickly, what are these? Well, the hue is actually the colour itself, so you can see the dot going around the wheel. You don't see anything on screen at the moment because saturation is 0. So let's push saturation all the way over, and then you can see how you've got the full range of colours or hues. As I say, in this case we're actually on the midtones, and then from whichever one you've then got luminance. Make it brighter or darker. And of course you can do the whole thing from within here. Saturation goes from outside to centre, and you can move around the circle to change the hue. Alright, let's just reset all these. And let's get a different picture in just to show the subtleties of blending and balance. I'm sure it's quite clear at the moment now that you can introduce a colour, the saturation of the colour and the luminance of that colour or hue into a shadow. You can do the same thing in midtones here, and you can do the same thing in highlights here. A lot of this can be done by eye, but if you want to give it a little kickstart with a little bit of colour theory to understand complementary colours and opposites and this, that and the other, I do have a video on that which I'll link to above now, which possibly you can have a check of later. But let's get a different picture in for the moment just to do the look at blending and balance. So this picture is black through to white, and I've just put some bars on to help divide it. It is a smooth gradient through the two. So let's take the shadows and let's introduce in the shadows a blue, and let's bring the saturation right up, and you can see how that is not affected over here, as it wouldn't be. Hardly, it's seeping slightly into the midtones, but it's predominantly in the shadows. Incidentally, it will not impact pure black. and of course you can do the luminance within that as well. Okay, so that's the shadows. Let's do something at the opposite end, and for this I'll bring the saturation all the way up, and I'm going to go around for about a yellow type colour, possibly a bit more, and I'm going to bring the luminance down a little bit. And here we can see that in the highlights we've introduced the yellow a little bit seeping in the mid-tones, and again as you get towards white you get very little colour going in there. Even if we bring the luminance down, it's our best bet of starting to get that in there, but at the negative point of decreasing natural brilliance, and that might not be something you want. But that's by the by. Let's now go into the mid-tones, and in the mid-tones, bring the saturation right up. I'm going to put something greeny, I think. Right, so we've gone now from a darker blue in the shadows, a green in the mid-tones, and a yellow in the highlights. Now let's have a look at blending and balance. So blending is what split toning used to do, and the color grade panel here replaced split toning. It's about the isolation of the colors. So if we go to 0, there is a maximum separation between the colors. You can see it's more defined border. It's still blurred, but more defined border here between the blue going into the green and the green going into the yellow. If we go to the other end, that crossover is more blurred. All right, so at plus 100, you've got the maximum amount of blending. So that's more subtle, but you might want it more extreme. So that's what blending does. And I had to use this picture to demonstrate it because it's not obvious on a picture where you could have a bit of shadow up here, a bit of shadow down there, a bit of mid-tone up here, and it just doesn't lend itself to visually seeing that. So that's blending, but what is balance? Balance is how you draw, if you like, the midpoint between shadows and darks. So right down in the middle here is the default. If I bring this over to the left, notice we've more or less lost the yellow. We've actually pushed everything in to a set of priority, if you like, to the shadows. So minus 100 is maximum priority of the shadows, so they encroach all over the color grade you've done across the 3 mids, shadows and highlights. And if we go to the other side, I'll do it slowly so you can see it coming back to where we were, and as I drift off the other side you can see that blue being pushed out to the left until eventually we end up with hardly any, if at all. If there is, it's hidden in the darks. So that's the balance. So where would that come in handy? It would come in handy picture to picture. If you've got something which is predominantly dark, you might want to actually favour the highlights and actually shift the balance over as an attempt to bring a bit more luminance and colour grading into it. But it's all by eye. It's visual really. So priority to the shadows, priority to the highlights, smooth transition between the 3, more sharp transition between the 3. Drop down box here makes it so much easier. Moving the slider from there to there, even visually on screen, the range you've got there is a lot larger than the range you've got here. Okay, and doing it on that, well, you don't get a free electron microscope with Adobe Lightroom, so I wouldn't advocate trying to use this. What's this one on the end? This one on the end is global. Now global is like a wash. It goes over what you have already done. Alright, so if you make a change to a global, so let's bring the hue around to a purple and bring the saturation up. There's as much purple being introduced, if you look over here at the shadows and at the highlights, in all areas. This is where you want to blend an overall look and feel across your picture after you've done some colour grading. Again, colour grading is subtle. It's far easier for me to show it here in extreme to get the point over. But you might want to put just a slight red haze over a picture or blue tinge. This is where you can use the global side to that. Let's not forget, of course, we do have such tools in here as hue, saturation and luminance. where you've got under hue 8 colors, under saturation the same, and under luminance the same, and we can alter these to change the hue of the reds. So let's choose a blue hue of the blues. You can change the saturation of the blues, and each time we're having to jump down between the three, which is why I prefer using the color tab. It's exactly the same thing, except the hue, saturation, luminance are all grouped together against red. They're all grouped together against orange. They're all grouped together against yellow. So you're jumping down colors, whereas here you're jumping down the settings. And if you wanted to just work with blues, you've got to be here to here to here. Whereas in the color version of the same thing, if you want to work with blues, they're all there. So there are other ways of doing it. Again, this is a global change, but essentially that is what our color grading wheels do. I wouldn't touch that. It's not accurate enough for me. I'd always go for the individuals, possibly put a graduated one on, a global one on the end, and leave this down so that you can get maximum use of the sliders to be accurate as possible. And for any one, by the way, you click on the eye and it switches it off. So you can temporarily hold that down to see a before and after on the particular one you're interested in. So let's go back to this picture and let's put a color grading on it. But before I would color grade something, I would ask myself, what is it I want to do? Sometimes, yes, I go to a picture and I just have a bit of a play. But quite often I'll look at a picture and get some idea what I want to do. Here for this one, I think I want to produce a slightly little bit more warmth, a little bit more yellow into the highlights, possibly some into the midtones, but in the shadows, I want to put in a little bit more of a darker blue into the shadows. But regardless of that, I would almost always go to my basic panel and make the initial edit and adjustments if I felt they needed them to tones, etc. For now, I'm just going to click on Auto, and I'm going to bring the contrast up a little bit, and I'm going to bring the shadows down. Now, the reason why I've done shadows and contrast is to highlight a point here. We've got highlights and we've got shadows, and we've got contrast that impacts between them. However, in color grading, we're now talking about making changes to shadows and highlights and midtones too. Okay, we're talking about colours in them, and we're talking about the strength of the colour with saturation and the brilliance of them with luminance. But notwithstanding that, we are addressing shadows and highlights, and in the basic panel, we are addressing shadows and highlights. So these can complement each other, or they might even fight each other. So I always advocate getting your basic editing done so you're happy with the picture before you then go on to colour grading. Do it the other way around if you want to, that's fine, but be mindful that they might unpick each other's knitting or complement each other. So I would go basics, I would go my colour grading if it's required, but then I would always pop back to basic and see if I want to just slightly fine tune some of those settings because they may have been knocked off centre a little bit by the colour grading. That said, what did I say about my shadows on this one? Well, I did want to do something with it, so let's bung the saturation up. I said and move the hue around. I said I wanted to get around to a darker blue, and I think that is a blue heading towards purple there, a bit of a richer blue, and I'm actually going to bring the luminance down on that as well. Click on the eye for before and after. Actually, I'm going to brighten that up a little bit. I didn't want to take it down after all. Okay, that's what I saw happening in my mind's eye. And the observant amongst you might have realised that this is hardly subtle, and I've been talking about this being subtle. No, I decided I wouldn't be very subtle, taking us through seeing this actually being used more easily on screen, and we'll get better at that as we go to the next examples. And the highlights, I wanted to warm them, so let's bump the saturation all the way up so I can see what we're doing. And then move around to a warmth. I'm going to keep it heading towards the orange, and then bring the saturation back a little bit. A bit more. Alright, so I think that's about it. I wasn't going to touch the mids, but I think these are still a little bit light, so I will, after all, saturation all the way up, and the mids I'm going to bring it around towards where the shadows were, possibly a little bit more towards the purple, and bring that saturation down, but also bring the luminance down a little bit. And it's bringing it nicely for my eye in the sky. Now, whether you like this or not is, as I've said in previous ones, irrelevant, because everything is subjective. I'm just showing you the tools and how to use them. You might have a completely different idea on this. So if we turn the whole thing off and we turn it back on, there we go. Right, so that is one way we could use this to make the changes. But hold on, you say, haven't we got tools such as a graduated filter, which we could have brought down, covering most of the sky? And couldn't we have then altered the temperature in the sky using this? You can certainly do that, but it impacts everything in the filter. Hold on, you say, but we can actually use a range mask to go and target a luminance value. Now let me just make a change so we can see this more clearly, deliberately bringing this down on the exposure, just to show this. So if I take the range of the luminance over, you can see it's now only impacting the really light areas as we go to there. Reset that, and now if I change that, it's only the higher luminant areas that are getting the change. And we could have done it by colour. And where those luminance values are close to rolling off, earlier we looked at blending and we looked at balance. Well, here you can actually have a smoothness to roll those colour changes in or not. Why am I showing you that? I'm showing you that because there's not just one tool here. You don't necessarily have to do colour grading. If your answer is just in an adjustment tool or a brush, which has the same concept of being able to put a range mask in based on colour or luminance, you may just be able to get away with what you want in a particular colour. So let's, if we say for example we've got hue, saturation and luminance, we click on there because I don't know exactly what colour it is, and I go and place it on there, hold, and I drag up because I want to increase the saturation of those colours. You can see the aqua and blue creeping up there. When I did that, I didn't know that was aqua and blue. I might have guessed it was blue, but I didn't know there was aqua in it. So it pays to actually grab the tool, put it on the colour you're interested in, hold down, and then you can actually make the adjustments. So there you go. That was just to show you, let's not forget the other tools are there. So we're going to stop with this one and go on to another picture. All right, we've got a black and white picture here. You're going to colour grade a black and white, Mark? Yes, I am. So if you think of the original example that we had, where it was just a grading from black to white, and we're able to influence that by colour grading. That is the beauty of colour grading on a black and white. In fact, it's an advantage sometimes to take a full colour picture, make it black and white, and then come back in to do your colour grading if you're after a two-tone or a tri-tone type effect. So let's just jump straight into basics here, and I want to make a few little changes. Bring up the contrast a little bit, bring the white point down. I want to introduce a bit more blacks in there. I'm going to put a bit of texture in the picture, and I'm on an edit here, so I'm just going to make this a square crop. I think it probably would be better off as a square crop, something like that. Right, now we've got some noise in there. I'm just going to get rid of the noise. Quite a bit. And why not, let's sharpen it a little bit. So I'm going to bring the sharpening up, hold down my Alt or Option key while I move the mask tool over, and what is left in white will be the parts that are sharpened, and leave go. Right, happy with that. And so let's jump into colour grading. That was a million mile an hour edit, there we go. So what do we want to do here? Well, let's go to start with the highlights, shall we? And in the highlights, throw the saturation way over so we can see what we're doing by picking our colour. And in the highlights, I want to bring just slightly off yellow, almost trying to get a sepia effect on this, and then bring the saturation down and just lift it up as a luminant value. There you are. I've introduced a bit of a sepia. So what I would like to do now in the shadows is throw the saturation right up so I can see what colours we're talking about. Go around to a darker version of that same sepia colour. Bring the luminance down and roll that saturation back. Missed it. There we are. And then I don't think I'm going to alter the midtones. I'm going to leave them so there's a bit more of the grey, as you can see from the black and white that were there, but possibly come over to the global and throw my saturation way up and get around to that an overall type yellow type heading towards brown effect that we had, and roll the saturation way back on that one and darken it slightly. Okay, so the global effect before and after, the whole effect before and after, go from there to there. So there is an advantage in using colour grading on black and white, and sometimes if you're not happy with the colour picture and you want to do something a bit different, throw it into black and white and then go into the colour grading. Let's do another one. So this picture here came from Michael Dam. Again, it's on splash.com, free stock photo. With this picture, the first thing that I wanted to do is I wasn't so happy with so much of the red, but that wasn't a colour grading thing. So the first thing I thought about just doing a basic edit, which I'm just going to click on auto for that. That doesn't help me because it's made the reds even lighter. So I'm going to bring down the shadows a bit, and you can see it darkening down here in particular, a little bit more texture. I'm going to take off that vibrance that it added on the auto, bump up the contrast a little bit. This is all just by eye and to suit my particular preferences. It might not be yours. Now, it's not a colour grade thing this just yet. So I want to go to hue, saturation and luminance. Go to my colour, go to my reds, and I want to take down the saturation of the red a little bit, just a little bit, and bring down the darkness on it as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go into colour grading because I do want to colour grade here. What I actually want to do is only one small part. I just want to make some changes to the skin tones. And in doing skin tones, this is just a very, very subtle one. So we're going to go for highlights and throw our saturation all the way over, as is how I use my workflow, and come round to an orange colour because there's a lot of orange in skin tones there. And I'm going to roll that saturation down and down and down. Oh, coincidentally, they're more or less the same values there. And take the luminance up a little bit. And before and after, you can see there's a little bit more natural colour in the skin. Now, a good complementary colour to use here is like a purple or a tealy type effect. So I'm going to go to the shadows and throw my saturation all the way over, run around the wheel till we find the colour I'm looking for, which is about there, and take the saturation down and do before and after. And I think that's nice because that introduces a teal, which is also picked out in some of the hair detail as well, which complements the slight lift that we've given to the orange in the face. Right, let's move on to another picture. So it's a bit of a cop-out with this last one because I really like this picture. So this picture was from Nicole Gerry, from unsplash.com, and I just think it's really well balanced. I think the colours in it, I think the exposure is fine. If I was being nitpicky, but I think it adds to the time of night and what you'd expect. I think there's too much reflections in the glasses. But in terms of colour grading, I wouldn't necessarily change this. I think that in terms of an edit, I'm just going to leave as is. I think what I probably might do is add a slight vignette to darken the corners, and you can see that draws your eyes into the centre of the picture. Possibly, again, not colour grading. I might take some of the lights away from here. But there you go. I think this is great. So that's why this one, I'm just going to pop over into Photoshop and we're going to do an element of colour grading. And it doesn't matter whether that element is strong or slight. The idea here is to show the extra things you can actually do when you're in Photoshop that you can't do or can't do as fully. So here we are in our familiar sunny Photoshop. I'm thinking to myself, I want to just put a different look across the whole picture, which classes as a colour grade. And the go-to effect for that is Colour Lookup. Colour Lookup applies LUTs or lookup tables, which are combinations of different ways colours are handled and contrasts and so on and so forth. I'm going to be doing a video on these showing how you can take lookup tables from Photoshop and have them as presets in Lightroom. But for now, you've got a whole load of lookup tables you can use. So crisp warm, crisp winter, and I think it's late sunset are ones I tend to go for when I'm wanting to change a look completely of a picture. But you know what, it varies time and time. But let's stick with late sunset. Now, as you can see, that's radically changed it, and not for the better. So I would firstly drop this into overlay, one of my preferred layer blend modes for color grading, and then I would dial it back down because it's far too strong. I think it would probably go down as far as about 30, probably 30, 32, something like that, and before and after. So what's the deal with Photoshop being better? Well, you are constrained to certain things in terms of masking from luminosity or color, whatever, in Lightroom, and the rest of the things are global. But here, because every single adjustment layer has got a mask, you can change the opacity and the fill of the adjustment, but within the mask, you can choose to take things out. Now, for this particular picture, I rather liked, I'll switch it off, I rather like the lighter teal look of the steel. So I'm going to put that back in by clicking on the mask, B for my brush tool, D for default colours, X to get black as my foreground colour. Come up with my brush, make sure I've got something like a soft round brush in there. We'll go with full opacity because I know I've already reduced the effect by 30, and I'm just going to bring some of this teal effect, which I rather liked on the steel, teal on the steel. That was not intended, but there we go. And some in the bits of the car, the relic of the car. And so there you go. So that's switch that off. So before the filter, that's incidentally holding down the shift key and clicking on the mask. So before we did that, and after, and before and after. Okay, we could go on all day. We've already nearly hit 30 minutes on this. I just thought I'd quickly jump over to Photoshop because there's so many different things you can do. I've got a number of videos on color grading if you check the playlist out. If I can link to a playlist, I'll put it above. If not, I will link to a particular video of mine which has got a lot of these things in above, and I'll do that now. And that's it, really. So I'm going to jump back to Lightroom. They're the pictures we've worked on. So they're all in the bundle for you to hopefully you've already downloaded that because you've been following along. and I'm going to play an outro now. Alright, there we go. That was the colour grading in Lightroom and Photoshop. I hope you found that very useful, and as usual, leave comments below. And if you liked this, then why not click on that subscribe button? It's all high tech. And leave any comments, any questions, and we'll do it all again next time. See you later.